Hello, Pathfinders. I think you're going to find our little study of apologetics this week not just interesting, it's not just fascinating, but I think you're going to find this week's study also very encouraging. You know, when we do apologetics, yes, we are making a defense for our faith. But as we study apologetics, in addition to helping us make a better defense for our faith, it's also at the same time building up our faith. It should encourage us in our faith. So I think you'll see a good example of that this week when we look at an apologetic for the whole foundation of our apologetics and our defense, and that is the Bible. Let me share my screen with you so that we can look at the PowerPoint for this week. And let's look at the topic of apologetics again. Again, apologetics is making a verbal defense of our faith. But as we're going to see today, I think it also builds up our faith at the same time. Remember last week what we said about the nature of the Christian faith? It's an historical faith. It's a testable faith. And this week, we're going to get the prime example of on what basis we can make these claims about Christianity being historical and testable. And that's going to get us to this very important question about the Bible. Can we really trust the Bible? You know, we can say we believe the Bible and this is how we defend our faith, but how do we know the Bible is accurate? How do we know that it's authentic? How do we know that it is historically reliable? That's a pretty important question, and we're going to try to answer that today. The historical reliability of the New Testament is a very important topic today. And you know what? We ought to be able to put the New Testament, the Bible, to the same kind of test that we would put any ancient historical document. And we're going to do that here this week. This is a whole fascinating study. It's actually an academic discipline known as historiography. And this is simply the scientific academic study of the processes and principles by which scholars can determine the authenticity of any document. So the test of historiography applies to not just the Bible. We can put the Bible to these tests, but any ancient document, whether it's ancient writings of Plato or Aristotle or some ancient historian, ancient documents have to be put to the test to determine whether they are authentic. And we're going to see here in this study three specific tests that scholars apply to ancient documents. And we're going to apply these to the Bible this week. First of all, there's what's known as the internal evidence test. And by this test, scholars are examining whether you can trust the writings internally by looking at the document itself. Here's some of the questions scholars try to answer. Again, this applies to any old ancient document, any writing. Is it consistent internally? Is it cohesive? Does it contradict itself? Is it confirming? Can we really trust the writing? Does it have the ring of authenticity? Does the author claim to be reporting truth or just writing a piece of fiction? So we can use some of these tests, some of these questions, and apply them to any ancient writing. And when we look at the New Testament, this is what we discover. We see the New Testament writers, they claim to be writing truth. They claimed to be writing historical facts and incidents and things that people said, and they backed up these claims with eyewitness testimony that could be verified. We looked at the introduction to Luke's gospel. Luke wasn't there for any of the life of Jesus. So a critic would say, well, how can Luke write the story about Jesus, about his birth, his life, his death, burial, resurrection? He wasn't there for any of it. But Luke tells us at the beginning of his gospel that he read some other accounts about Jesus, and then Luke says, I've interviewed people. I've talked to eyewitnesses who were there. So what he was going to write in giving us a history of the life of Jesus, it was backed up by eyewitness testimony, and that adds a lot of credibility. That leads a lot to the authenticity of the New Testament. Here's an interesting little internal evidence test. Were the writers willing to report embarrassing material? And we see this in the Bible. Biblical writers, if they were reporting truth, they would have to report the whole truth about the lives of people that they were writing about. And we see in the Old Testament, for example, we see the sad story of David and his sins there and his sin with Bathsheba. Quite embarrassing. If somebody would say, well, if we're going to write about David, let's just make up a story and let's skip over that part of the story. But no, they reported the facts of that embarrassing incident because they really happened. And the writers of scripture were trying to accurately record what actually happened. We see the same thing in the New Testament with Peter, and we know toward the end of Jesus's life, there when Jesus was on trial. And what did Peter do? He denied Christ 3 times. Well, it would have been easy for the New Testament writers to leave out that kind of a detail. That doesn't shed a very good light on Peter, but they included those reports because they felt like they had to report those incidents because they really happened. So these are all internal evidence tests. And again, in evaluating any ancient document, scholars say, here's the starting point. We're going to give that document the benefit of the doubt. In other words, we're not going to come to study this particular document with some kind of presupposition, some preconceived idea about whether it's good or bad, whether it's true or false. They give the document the benefit of the doubt. Secondly, you also look internally at the document and you try to see, are there contradictions? Are there obvious known contradictions in the material? Well, that would certainly dismiss authenticity of a document if it contradicts itself. And we're going to look here in a couple of weeks at some of the so-called contradictions that people say are in the Bible. Good example of this is the death of Judas. We have 2 different accounts of the death of Judas in the gospel account. Judas hangs himself in the book of Acts. Judas falls down head first and his bowels burst forth. And so critics might say, well, we can't trust the New Testament. There's a contradiction. But that's not really a blatant contradiction. That's not really a contradiction because you can harmonize both of those accounts. Yes, Judas went and hung himself. Maybe the rope broke, or at some point somebody cut him down. And yes, he would have fallen on the ground. He would have fallen. His internal organs would have spilled forth, being in a bloated state. Exactly what the book of Acts says. So the New Testament is free of obvious known contradictions, and that adds to its credibility and authenticity. And then you also look at when the document was actually written. Was it written close to the time when the events recorded actually happened? And we'll come back to that in just a minute. So there's the internal evidence test. And on the basis of that test, the New Testament is amazingly reliable. It's authentic when you put it to the internal test. The second test is called the bibliographical test. And here the scholars are examining questions related to the documents themselves, to the actual manuscripts. Here are the questions. How many handwritten copies actually exist? And in those copies, how many discrepancies are there between the different copies? What is the distance of the copies from where the original document was written? You know, copies and documents that were written hundreds and hundreds of miles away from where the events happened, probably not as reliable as documents and manuscripts that were written in that same region where the events actually happened. And then how close time-wise are the copies to the original documents? These are all very important bibliographical tests. And let's put the New Testament to this test. If we compare, this is pretty amazing. If you compare the New Testament to any other ancient writing, how does it stand up to the number of manuscripts and the age of the manuscripts? Here on the screen, you've got the New Testament. When was it originally written? All the books of the New Testament written between 45 and 90 AD. Look at the number of available copies that we have to look at. These are old, ancient manuscripts and copies that are available in libraries and museums that scholars can study. We have over 7,000 ancient manuscripts to look at. The oldest copy that we have dates to 125 AD. Compare that to the original. We're talking here 25, 30, 40 years after the original New Testament documents were written to the time that we start having copies appear that are available to us to look at. That's such a short time span there. Not a lot of opportunities for discrepancies or contradictions or errors to have crept into the text. That's an amazing way of proving the authenticity and the accuracy of the New Testament. Compare that to the writings of Aristotle, for example. Aristotle wrote 384 to 322 BC. If we went to libraries and museums around the world, guess what? There are only 10 available copies that scholars can look at. And that's not many copies to look at. And look at the date of the oldest copy of the writings of Aristotle. You know, if we go to the library, we pull out the writings of Aristotle. We're not looking at the original documents that Aristotle wrote or what was written about him. We're looking at copies of copies of copies of copies over hundreds of years. And the oldest copy that we have dates to 1100 AD. Look at the time gap there. The oldest copy to when it was written. We're talking here, what, 1400 years between the oldest copy that we have to look at versus when the original writings were made. So much more time for more copying errors to have crept into the text. So on the basis of this kind of manuscript evidence, when was it written? How close were the copies to the original? The New Testament far exceeds any ancient writing, and we can compare that to any of these ancient documents. Scholars don't question the authenticity or the accuracy of any of these ancient histories. Herodotus, uh, Thucydides, Tacitus, but look at when they were written. Look at the earliest surviving copies. Look at the time gap between when the original writings were made and the oldest copies that we have available. Look at the time gap. Look at the number of copies. It's just a handful. And look at the New Testament again, from the when it was written, the earliest copies that we have complete manuscripts of the New Testament within a couple of hundred years of when the New Testament was completed. The number of copies, thousands and thousands of ancient copies that scholars can look at to compare and contrast. How about this? I love what I have here on the screen. This kind of blows your mind. There are 5,700 copies of the New Testament in the original language of Greek. So scholars can look at manuscripts in libraries and museums all around the world. There are 5,700 copies. So this allows historians to compare one of these copies with all the other copies to see how well they match up. If you to put all these copies together in one big room and matched them up, you could pull one copy and compare it to all the others. Based on this comparison, scholars have been able to identify a 94% word for word match of all the copies. See what that says? Even after hundreds and hundreds of years of copying and copying and copying, the copies all match up to 94% accuracy between all the copies. Interesting trivia here. There are 138,020 words in the New Testament. All 5,700 copies match precisely for 129,738 words. There's your 94%. So that leaves some discrepancies. there are some variant readings among the copies, and that's leaves this remaining 6%. So you might say 6%, we might have some errors in the copies. But look at this. Scholars state that 4% of this 6% can be attributed to simple misspellings, maybe notes in the margins of some of these ancient writings, maybe a little punctuation errors. So this really leaves only 2% of the text open to review for possible errors in the copies, in the text. But scholars argue that of this 2% of the text for which there's still some uncertainty, none of this 2% has any impact on the basic message being delivered. They're usually simple things like similar statements made using slightly different vocabulary, syntax, maybe a different word ordering, nothing significant, no significant differences between all 5,700 copies of the New Testament that we have available to us. And that's really amazing. This means that the 5,700 copies of the originals, we don't have the original writings, we have these old copies written very close to when the originals were written. They are at least 98% consistent with one another. This means that on text evidence alone, you can feel 98 to 99% sure that the words you read in your New Testament today are the exact representation of those original writings. That's amazing. And you know what? When you put the New Testament up against the internal evidence test and this bibliographical evidence test, this absolutely makes the New Testament the most textually reliable document in all of antiquity. Pretty conclusive evidence there for the reliability and the accuracy of the Bible. So we have the internal evidence test, we have this amazing bibliographical evidence test, but there's a third test that scholars used. Again, evaluating any ancient document. It's called the external evidence test. And now scholars are examining, are there any external sources of evidence outside the manuscript itself that would support the claims that are made within the document? In other words, are there external historical reports? What about archaeological findings? So let's look at these two, historical reports and archaeological findings. The historical evidence is pretty amazing for the New Testament. Here's an external source, all right? This is an external non-biblical historian by the name of Tacitus, and you can see when he lived. This is really within the New Testament period. He lived AD 56 to 120. And Tacitus reports this terrible fire that happened in Rome in 64 AD. And there's no question about this fire that happened in Rome in that year. Many people believe that the Emperor Nero himself was the one who started this particular fire. But Nero blamed the Christians. And in fact, Tacitus reports this very thing. And I want you to notice in his historical account here, what he wrote, he's going to verify some things that we read about in the New Testament. This is what Tacitus wrote. Therefore, to squelch the rumor about Nero starting the fire, Nero created scapegoats and subjected to the most refined tortures those whom the common people called Christians. So there's an external historical reference to these early followers of Jesus Christ, who must have been a historical figure. He goes on, this was a group hated for their abominable crimes. Their name comes from Christ. He's mentioning there the name of Jesus. He was a historical figure who, during the reign of Tiberius, that was another historically verifiable Roman emperor, had been executed by the procurator, the governor, Pontius Pilate. And we read about Pilate in the New Testament. I won't read the rest of Tacitus's report there, but I want you to see here's an external source, a pagan historian who, being a Roman, he obviously would have dismissed anything having to do with Christianity, but he reported Christians, he reported Christ, he reported that he was executed, he reported he was executed under Pontius Pilate. And that matches up with exactly what the Gospels tell us about Jesus and his arrest and his trials and his death. Here's another, probably the most famous Jewish historian, and you can see he was born just a few years after the resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus. The historian Josephus. And I want you to notice what he writes. So here's an external source. He's going to affirm a lot of the facts that we read in the New Testament. He even writes, at this time, there was a wise man called Jesus. Jesus wasn't some made up mythical figure. He really lived. Here's an outside observer and historian who records that. His conduct was good and he was known to be virtuous. Many people among the Jews and other nations became his disciples. He gained followers, just like what we read in the New Testament. Here again, Pilate condemned him to be crucified and to die. So there's another external historical evidence there from a Jewish historian about Pilate and about Jesus being crucified. But those who had become his disciples did not abandon his discipleship. They reported that he had appeared to them after 3 days after his crucifixion. Josephus is saying here, his followers, Jesus' followers, talked about a resurrection, and he's reporting that. He was alive. Accordingly, he goes on, he was perhaps this Jewish Messiah concerning whom the prophets have reported wonders. And the tribe of the Christians, so named after him, has not disappeared to this day. Wow, there is pretty conclusive historical record there about Jesus, about his death, about his followers reporting a resurrection. He's attesting to what's recorded for us in the New Testament. Here's something else that Josephus wrote, and I'm just going to mention this because in other writings, I have it highlighted there in yellow, he mentions this brother of Jesus by the name of James. And he writes here about how the Roman authorities wanted to arrest James. He was one of the leaders there of the church at Jerusalem. We read about that in the New Testament. But what I want you to see here, Josephus is attesting to the fact that there was a brother, actually a half brother of Jesus, and his name was James. And that's exactly what's reported for us in the New Testament. 3 times in the New Testament talks about James, the brother of Jesus. So this Jewish historian is giving a stamp of authenticity on some very important facts and figures and history that is recorded for us in the New Testament. And then finally, as we wrap it up this week, we can look at archaeological evidence. And for the Bible, this is pretty amazing. Archaeology is confirmed so many of the things that we read about in the Bible. There have been volumes written on this. I just mentioned a few of these. In the Old Testament, archaeology is confirmed Egypt's invasion of Israel, the Assyrian siege of Lachish, the trade relations between Israel and Sheba, the nation of Sheba, the Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, the reigns of these kings, Omri, Ahab, Uzziah, Hezekiah, Ahaz, Jeroboam II, Jehoiakim, all of these historical people, historical events, we have conclusive archaeological evidence. That adds to a lot of the credibility that we believe the Bible possesses, its authenticity. Certainly the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls back in the 1940s, perhaps the most important archaeological discovery in history. And the Dead Sea Scrolls proved decisively the reliability, the accuracy of the Old Testament scriptures, and how meticulously they had been copied over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. So archaeology has done wonders to show that we can trust the Bible. It's history, it's testable, there's evidence behind it. Remember, that's what we said about the Christian faith. It's historical, it's testable, and we can make that claim because we can trust, we can affirm what the Bible claims. We can trust the Bible. How important is this? This is the foundation of our faith. This is the foundation of all of our defense, our apologetics. It's based upon the accuracy, the truthfulness, the reliability, the authenticity of the Bible. And on the basis of these three tests, the internal evidence test, the Bible surpasses all ancient documents. The bibliographical test, strong evidence, better than any other ancient writing. And finally, the external evidence test, external historical reports and the findings of archaeology. And I go back to one of our key apologetic texts here in Hebrews chapter 11. What does this say about the nature of our faith? Faith is the substance, key word there, the substance of things hoped for. Listen, Christians, our faith has a substance behind it. It's based upon truth. It's based upon the Bible, and it's based upon the accuracy and the integrity and the authenticity of the Bible. There is a substance to our faith. And then Hebrews says, faith is the evidence of things not seen. We don't just have a blind faith. No, we have evidence. And the evidence that we have for our faith is recorded for us in the Bible. And as we've seen this week, the Bible is reliable. We can trust it. It's accurate. It's trustworthy. It's true. All right, that's our lesson in apologetics this week. I find that stuff interesting. I find it fascinating. And you know what? All that we looked at this week really encourages me in my faith. There is a foundation. We have substance to what we believe. And that's the reason why we can boldly and unapologetically defend our faith. Well, God bless you, Pathfinders. We're going to end there for this week, and we'll pick it up again next week. And we're going to look at another very interesting apologetic topic. Hope you have a great week. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye for now.